Hello and welcome back to the Cosmic Enigma. Here we share real-life experiences of encounters with the unknown, stories that come from beyond the stars, crafted to help you relax and drift off to sleep. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I love seeing just how far this mystery reaches. Now find a comfortable spot, take a deep breath, and let yourself be carried away. Story 1. I told them the scarf wasn't mine, said I had never seen it before. The officer barely looked up from his notes, accepted my claim without a hint of hesitation. Around us, autumn's chill seeped through gaps in the weathered wooden boards, carrying with it the rich scent of decaying leaves and damp earth. The scarf lay crumpled in the corner, its emerald threads catching the weak morning light like broken promises. My skin tingled with a cool dampness, remnants of earlier rain that clung stubbornly to the fabric of my coat. The air hung heavy, each breath a slow trickle over the lie lodged in my throat. I didn't mention the worn patch on the fabric's edge, identical to the one on my own, but my fingers still remembered its texture. That was 3 weeks ago. The scarf should have been the end of it, just another piece of evidence filed away in some forgotten case folder. Instead, it became the beginning of something I can't quite name, something that sits at the edge of my consciousness like a word I can't remember, a song I can't quite hum. I've been different since then, not in ways others would notice, but in the small spaces between thoughts where certainty used to live. My reflection takes a moment too long to catch up when I turn my head. Food tastes like it's been filtered through cotton. Sleep comes in fragments, interrupted by the feeling that I'm forgetting to remember something crucial. The house feels wrong too. Corners seem deeper than they should be. The hallway stretches longer at certain times, though I've never measured it to be sure. My footsteps echo differently, as if the walls have shifted their positions while I wasn't paying attention. There's a persistent smell I can't identify, something like new plastic mixed with cold metal, faint but constant. I started keeping a journal, hoping that writing things down might help piece together what's missing. The entries are sporadic, disconnected thoughts that don't quite connect to anything concrete. But they're all I have, these fragments of a puzzle with no picture on the box to guide me. The first real clue came when I was cleaning out old files on my computer. Buried in a folder I didn't remember creating was an audio file with no name, just a string of numbers that meant nothing to me. The timestamp showed it was recorded the same night I found myself standing in that abandoned building with no memory of how I'd gotten there. I hesitated before clicking play. Something deep in my chest tightened, a warning that felt both urgent and familiar. But curiosity won, the way it always does when you're trying to solve the mystery of your own missing pieces. The audio began with static, the kind that sounds almost like breathing if you listen long enough. Then my own voice emerged from the speakers, distant and strange, speaking words I didn't remember saying. The lights are moving again. They're not supposed to move like that, not in patterns that make sense. I can hear something behind me, but when I turn around, there's nothing. Just the smell of ozone and something else, something organic and wrong. My recorded voice paused, and in the silence, I could hear a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't quite musical either. It pulsed with an irregular rhythm that made my teeth ache just listening to it. I think I'm being watched. No, that's not right. I think I'm being measured, like something is taking my dimensions, figuring out how much space I occupy in the world. The air tastes metallic now. My hands are shaking, but I can't stop recording. I need to remember this. I need proof that this is happening. The file ended abruptly, cutting off mid-sentence. I played it again immediately, then again. Each time, new details emerged from the static background. Soft clicking sounds that might have been footsteps or might have been something else entirely. A whisper that could have been wind or could have been a voice speaking words in a language I didn't recognize. But it was the tone of my own voice that disturbed me most. I sounded calm, almost hypnotized, as if I were narrating a dream rather than living through something that clearly terrified me. There was a disconnect between the fear in my words and the measured way I spoke them, like I was reading from a script I'd never seen before. That night I dreamed of corridors that bent in impossible directions. The walls were covered in a pattern that hurt to look at directly, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't focusing on them. I walked for what felt like hours, my footsteps echoing in a rhythm that didn't match my pace. In the dream, I carried something in my hands, something small and warm that pulsed like a heartbeat. I couldn't look down to see what it was, couldn't bend my neck or move my eyes from the path ahead, but I could feel it growing warmer, could sense it changing shape in my grip. When I woke, my hands were clenched into fists so tight my nails had left crescent marks in my palms. The smell of new plastic and cold metal was stronger than usual, so strong I had to open all the windows despite the morning chill. I started paying closer attention to the small wrongnesses in my daily life, the way shadows fell at angles that didn't match the light sources, the way my coffee cup was always empty when I was sure I'd just filled it, the way conversations with neighbors seemed to skip beats as if whole sentences were being edited out in real time. My journal entries became more detailed, more urgent. I wrote about the sound of electronics humming in frequencies that made my vision blur. I wrote about finding doors slightly ajar that I was certain I'd closed. I wrote about the growing certainty that something was trying to communicate with me through the static between radio stations. But it was the photographs that really unsettled me. I'd been taking pictures compulsively, trying to document the subtle changes in my environment. Most of them showed nothing unusual, just the ordinary spaces of my ordinary life, but in some of them there were details that shouldn't have been there. In a picture of my living room, a shadow fell across the carpet in the shape of a figure standing behind my chair, though I was alone when I took the photo. In another, the reflection in my television screen showed a room I didn't recognize, with walls that curved upward into darkness. The most disturbing was a selfie I'd taken without thinking, just testing the camera function on my phone. In it, my face looked normal, unremarkable, but my eyes were focused on something just over my own shoulder, and my expression was one of rapt attention, as if I were listening to something incredibly important that only I could hear. I had no memory of making that expression. I had no memory of looking at anything behind me, but there it was, captured in digital clarity, proof that my own face could become a stranger's. The second audio file appeared a week later in the same unnamed folder. This one was longer, filled with more of that breathing static and punctuated by sounds I couldn't identify. My voice was different this time, more strained, as if I were speaking through clenched teeth. The power went out an hour ago, but the lights are still on. Not the electric lights, the other ones. They pulse in sequences that almost make sense, like a code I should be able to crack if I just pay attention long enough. The humming is louder now. It's coming from inside the walls, or maybe from inside my head. I can't tell the difference anymore. There was a pause filled with that irregular electronic breathing. Then a sound like footsteps, but wrong somehow, as if whatever was walking had too many feet or was walking on a surface that didn't quite exist. Something is behind me. I can feel it watching, but I can't turn around. Every time I try, my body won't obey. It's It's like I'm a passenger in my own skin and someone else is driving. The air smells like copper and ozone and something else, something organic that makes my stomach turn. My recorded voice dropped to a whisper, so quiet I had to turn the volume all the way up to hear it. I think I know what it wants. I think I've always known. It's been trying to tell me something, and I've been pretending not to understand. But the pretending is getting harder. The knowledge is seeping in through the cracks in my resistance. Soon I won't be able to ignore it anymore. The file ended with a sound that might have been laughter or might have been crying. In the silence that followed, I realized I was holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. The house felt different, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl. I started seeing things in my peripheral vision, movements that disappeared when I turned my head, shapes that didn't belong to any furniture or fixture in my house. They were always just out of focus, just beyond the edge of clear sight, but they moved with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. My reflection began acting independently, taking a fraction of a second longer to mirror my movements. Sometimes it seemed to move first, as if it were leading and I were following. I stopped looking in mirrors unless absolutely necessary, but I could still feel my reflection watching me from every reflective surface. The dreams became more vivid, more detailed. I walked through spaces that defied physics, rooms where the ceiling was also the floor, corridors that looped back on themselves in impossible ways. Always I carried that warm, pulsing thing in my hands, and always I could feel something following behind me, matching my pace perfectly. In one dream, I finally managed to look down at what I was carrying. It was a small device, smooth and dark, covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly. As I watched, the symbols rearranged themselves, forming new patterns that seemed to burrow into my vision like living things. When I woke from that dream, my hands were cupped as if I were still holding something. The phantom weight of it lingered for hours, and I found myself unconsciously protecting empty air, as if something precious and fragile were resting in my palms. The third fragment came not as an audio file, but as a video, hidden in a folder within a folder within a folder on my hard drive. The file was corrupted, playing in stuttering bursts of image and sound that made it almost impossible to follow. But what I could see was worse than anything I'd heard in the audio recordings. The video showed me standing in a room I didn't recognize, though something about it felt familiar in a way that made my chest tight with anxiety. The walls were covered in that same shifting pattern from my dreams, and the air seemed thick with a haze that moved independently of any air current. In the video, I was speaking to someone or something off camera, gesturing with my hands as if explaining something complex and important. But there was no audio, just that same electronic breathing and the occasional burst of static that whited out the image completely. What disturbed me most was the expression on my face. I looked eager, almost excited, like I was sharing wonderful news with a dear friend. But my eyes were wrong, unfocused, and glassy, as if I were looking through the camera rather than at it. The video cut out frequently, jumping between moments that seemed disconnected from each other. In one frame, I was standing with my arms at my sides. In the next, I was reaching toward the camera with both hands, my mouth open as if I were shouting something urgent. The transition was seamless, but the change in position was too dramatic to be natural. Near the end of the file, there was a moment of perfect clarity. I was looking directly into the camera, and my expression had changed completely. The eagerness was gone, replaced by something that looked like recognition mixed with horror. My mouth formed words I couldn't hear, but I could read my own lips well enough to understand what I was saying. It's not supposed to be like this. This isn't what you promised. The video ended there, cutting to black so abruptly it felt like a physical blow. I sat in the silence of my living room, staring at the blank screen, trying to process what I'd just seen. The person in that video was undeniably me, but it was also a stranger, someone who knew things I didn't know and had experienced things I couldn't remember. That night the house felt different again. The walls seemed closer together, as if the rooms were slowly contracting around me. Every sound was amplified, from the settling of the foundation to the whisper of air moving through the vents. But underneath it all was that persistent humming, so low it was more felt than heard. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I could see those shifting patterns from the video, could feel them moving behind my eyelids like living things. The smell of new plastic and cold metal was so strong it made me nauseous, and I spent most of the night with the windows open, trying to clear the air. But the smell didn't come from outside. It came from inside, from somewhere deep in the house or deep in my head. It was the smell of change, of transformation, of something that had been one thing becoming something else entirely. The final fragment came to me not as a file, but as a memory, sudden and vivid and completely out of context with anything I was doing. I was washing dishes, my hands moving automatically through the familiar motions, when suddenly I was somewhere else entirely. I was standing in a vast space that might have been a room or might have been something else entirely. The walls curved upward into darkness, and the floor beneath my feet felt soft and yielding, like living tissue. The air was thick with that metallic smell, so concentrated it made my eyes water. In front of me stood something that might have been a person, but wasn't quite right. It was the right height, the right general shape, but the proportions were subtly wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate a human being from a description rather than a photograph. Its face was a blur of features that wouldn't hold still long enough for me to focus on them. It was speaking to me, or at least making sounds that my brain interpreted as speech. The words seemed to bypass my ears entirely, appearing directly in my mind as concepts rather than sounds. It was explaining something important about the nature of reality and my place in it. You were chosen, it said without saying, because you can hold the knowledge without breaking. Others tried, but they couldn't maintain the necessary flexibility of thought. They became rigid, unusable. But you bend without breaking, you adapt. I tried to respond, but my voice came out wrong, distorted and echoing as if I were speaking through water. The thing that might have been a person tilted its head at an angle that was definitely not human, listening with an attention that felt predatory. The process is almost complete, it continued. Soon you won't need to remember the before. The new configuration will be permanent, and you'll understand your purpose fully. The gaps in your memory are not damage, they're preparation, space being cleared for better things. I wanted to ask what it meant, what process it was talking about, but the memory was already fading, dissolving back into the mundane reality of my kitchen. My hands were still moving through the dishwater, but they were shaking now, and the plate I was holding slipped from my grip and shattered against the bottom of the sink. The sound of breaking porcelain seemed to echo longer than it should have, reverberating through the house like a signal. In the silence that followed, I could hear that humming again, but it was different now, more complex, as if multiple voices had joined the original tone. I looked down at the broken pieces of the plate, and for just a moment they seemed to arrange themselves into a pattern, the same shifting geometric design I'd seen in my dreams and in that corrupted video. Then I blinked, and they were just broken pottery again, meaningless fragments of something that used to be whole. But the pattern lingered in my vision, burned into my retinas like the afterimage of a bright light. It pulsed with its own rhythm, and I realized that rhythm matched the humming, matched the irregular electronic breathing from the audio files, matched the phantom heartbeat of the thing I carried in my dreams. Everything was connected: the scarf, the audio files, the dreams, the broken memories, the smell of new plastic and cold metal. They were all pieces of the same incomprehensible whole, fragments of an experience that had been carefully edited from my conscious mind but left traces everywhere else. I understood then that I wasn't investigating my own missing memories. I was being led through a carefully constructed maze, allowed to discover only what something else wanted me to find. The audio files hadn't been hidden, they'd been placed. The dreams weren't random, they were guided. Even my own curiosity wasn't entirely my own. The realization should have terrified me, but instead I felt a strange calm settling over my thoughts. It was the same hypnotic peace I'd heard in my own voice on those recordings, the same dreamy acceptance I'd seen on my face in that corrupted video. I was changing, had been changing all along, and fighting it was becoming more difficult with each passing moment. I walked to the bathroom and looked in the mirror, really looked, for the first time in weeks. My reflection stared back at me, but there was something different about the eyes. They were still my eyes, still the same color and shape, but they held knowledge that I didn't remember acquiring. They looked at me with a familiarity that felt foreign, as if my own reflection knew me better than I knew myself. Behind my reflection, the bathroom looked normal, unchanged, but I could see something else there too, something that existed in the space between the mirror and reality. It was watching, waiting, measuring my progress toward whatever I was becoming. I raised my hand to touch the glass, and my reflection raised its hand as well. But for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, I could have sworn my reflection moved first, leading the gesture instead of following it. In that moment, I wasn't sure which one of us was real and which was the reflection. The humming grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it wasn't coming from the walls or from inside my head. It was coming from the mirror itself, from the space between what I could see and what was actually there. It was a summoning, a call to step forward into the next phase of whatever process had begun that night I couldn't remember. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, and for a moment I felt warmth pressing back from the other side. The smell of new plastic and cold metal intensified, and I could taste copper on my tongue. The patterns from my dreams began to emerge in the condensation around my hand, writing themselves into existence without any input from me. The bathroom began to change, walls stretching upward into that familiar darkness, floor becoming soft and yielding beneath my feet. I was crossing over, moving from one reality into another, and the transition felt as natural as breathing. But just as I was about to step forward, to complete whatever transformation had been prepared for me, a part of my mind that still belonged entirely to me pulled back. I yanked my hand away from the mirror and stumbled backward, breaking the connection. The bathroom snapped back to normal so quickly it felt like a rubber band recoiling. The humming stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt hostile. In the mirror, my reflection looked disappointed, almost annoyed, before it remembered to match my own expression of shock and fear. I fled the bathroom, but I could feel something following me through the house, something that moved through reflections and shadows and the spaces between thoughts. It was patient, I realized. It had been patient all along. It could wait for me to be ready, wait for my resistance to crumble completely. Because it would crumble, I could feel it happening already, my sense of self becoming more flexible, more willing to accommodate new configurations. The knowledge it had tried to give me was still there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness, waiting for me to stop fighting and let it in completely. I sit now in my living room, writing this final entry in my journal, and I can feel that presence everywhere around me. It's in the walls, in the air, in the space behind my eyes. It's been reshaping me from the inside out, preparing me for a purpose I'm beginning to understand despite myself. The scarf was never evidence of anything that happened to me. It was evidence of what I'm becoming, a marker left by a future version of myself that exists in a reality where the transformation is complete. The officer didn't question my lie because part of him knew the truth was something his mind couldn't process. I can hear the humming starting again, soft and low and irresistibly hypnotic. The patterns are beginning to write themselves across my vision, and I can feel that warm, pulsing weight materializing in my hands. Soon, I won't need to carry it in dreams anymore. The house is changing around me, walls curving upward into darkness, and I know that when the transformation is complete, I'll understand everything. I'll know my purpose, know why I was chosen, know what I'm meant to become. But there's still a small part of me that wonders if understanding is worth the price of forgetting who I used to be. There's still a fragment of my original self that wants to resist, to hold on to the person I was before all of this began. The humming is getting louder and I can see movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that belong to the reality I'm moving toward. My reflection in the blank computer screen is smiling now, even though I'm not. It knows something I don't, or maybe it knows something I'm trying not to know. I should be afraid, but the fear is fading, replaced by that dreamy acceptance I've heard in my own voice, seen on my own face. The process is almost complete, just like the thing that wasn't quite human told me it would be. The only question left is whether I'll remember any of this once the transformation is finished, or if these fragments will be edited out like all the others, leaving only the new configuration behind. The humming has become a song now, complex and beautiful and utterly alien. I can feel myself beginning to sing along, though I don't know the words or understand the melody. But my voice knows it, has always known it, was perhaps designed specifically to harmonize with these impossible frequencies. I think I'm ready now. I think I've always been ready, and the resistance was just part of the process, a necessary stage before acceptance. The warm weight in my hands is growing heavier, more real, and I can see the symbols beginning to write themselves across its surface. Soon, very soon, I'll understand what they mean. Soon I'll understand everything. But first, I have one more question for whoever might find this journal, this record of a transformation that may or may not have happened the way I remember it. When you look in the mirror tonight, will your reflection be waiting for you, or will you be waiting for its story too? It hummed like a key vibrating in the lock, a sound too faint and persistent to ignore. The air felt dense, carrying the chill from places long forgotten. I stood by the window, fingertips brushing the glass, waiting for clarity that never arrived. The hum was continuous, resonating from a spot I couldn't place within the room, as if it traveled from where memory mingled with something darker. Each pulse of the sound pulled me away from the present, to a hallway lined with silent echoes, where footsteps once halted abruptly, leaving nothing but lingering unease. I shouldn't have noticed it, yet there it was. The sound returns every night now, threading through the walls of this place I call home. I've learned to recognize its rhythm, the way it builds from nothing into something that makes my teeth ache. The neighbors never mention it. When I ask, they look at me with that particular expression people reserve for those who claim to hear things that aren't there. But I know it's real because my phone responds to it. The screen flickers to life at precisely the moment the humming reaches its peak, displaying nothing but a wash of static before going dark again. Sleep has become a negotiation. I lie in bed listening to the house settle, but underneath those familiar creaks and sighs there's something else. A presence that seems to press against the windows from outside, testing the boundaries of glass and frame. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath as if making too much noise might invite something in. The heating system cycles on and off with no regard for the thermostat settings, filling rooms with air that smells faintly metallic, like pennies left in rain. My reflection in the bathroom mirror looks tired in ways that sleep can't fix. There are shadows under my eyes that seem deeper than they should be, and sometimes, just for a moment, I think I see movement behind me in the glass. But when I turn, there's only the familiar arrangement of towels and toiletries, everything exactly where I left it. The fluorescent bulb above the mirror has developed a stutter, casting irregular patterns of light that make my face appear unfamiliar to myself. The dreams began weeks ago, though I hesitate to call them dreams. They feel more like memories that belong to someone else, playing out behind my eyelids with uncomfortable clarity. I'm always standing in an open space, surrounded by darkness that feels alive. The ground beneath my feet pulses with a rhythm that matches the humming, and somewhere in the distance there's a light that shouldn't exist. It moves with purpose, tracing patterns against the sky that my mind struggles to process. I wake from these visions with the taste of copper in my mouth and the sensation that I've been holding a conversation I can't remember. During daylight hours, I find myself drawn to windows, scanning the horizon for something I can't name. The landscape looks different now, as if the angles of familiar buildings have shifted slightly while I wasn't paying attention. Trees that I've passed countless times seem to lean at new angles, their branches reaching toward something beyond my field of vision. Even the quality of sunlight feels changed, filtered through an atmosphere that carries whispers of elsewhere. I've started keeping a journal, though the entries often surprise me when I read them back. My handwriting appears normal, but the words describe experiences I don't remember having. References to conversations with figures who cast no shadows, descriptions of rooms in my house that don't exist, detailed accounts of watching lights dance across the sky from a vantage point I've never occupied. The ink varies in color despite using the same pen, ranging from deep black to a silvery gray that seems to shift depending on the angle of observation. The incident itself remains fragmented, like trying to remember a face scene in peripheral vision. I know something happened because my body remembers what my mind refuses to reconstruct. There's a tenderness along my spine, as if I'd been lying on hard ground for hours, and my clothes from that time carry a scent I can't identify. It's not unpleasant, but it doesn't belong to this world of fabric softeners and detergents. When I hold the garments to my face, I'm transported to a place where the air tastes different and gravity feels negotiable. The memory surfaces in pieces, usually when I'm occupied with mundane tasks. Washing dishes, I'll suddenly recall standing perfectly still while something moved around me in circles, just beyond the reach of my peripheral vision. The sensation was neither threatening nor comforting, but rather clinical, as if I were being catalogued. My breathing had slowed without conscious effort, and time seemed to stretch like warm glass, each second expanding to accommodate observations being made by intelligence I couldn't comprehend. There was a moment of absolute silence that felt louder than any sound I'd ever heard. The world had paused, holding its breath while something decided whether to reveal itself fully or retreat back into the spaces between reality. I remember wanting to turn my head to see what was studying me with such patient intensity, but my body wouldn't respond to conscious direction. I was a passenger in my own flesh, aware but not in control, watching events unfold from behind my own eyes. The light came from above and slightly to my left, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but rather possessed a quality that made everything it touched appear more real than reality itself. Colors became more vivid, textures more pronounced, and the very air seemed to crystallize into visible patterns. Under that illumination, I could see details in the landscape that shouldn't have been visible, as if the light penetrated matter itself to reveal hidden structures beneath the surface. Going further back, I remember the signs that preceded the encounter, though I didn't recognize them as signs at the time. The electronic devices in my temporary shelter had begun behaving strangely days before the main event. The radio would tune itself to frequencies that broadcast nothing but white noise punctuated by what sounded like breathing. My flashlight dimmed and brightened in patterns that seemed almost like communication, and the battery-powered clock ran backward for exactly 13 minutes before resuming normal operation. The temperature fluctuations were subtle but persistent. Despite the season being mild, I found myself alternating between wearing layers and stripping down to minimal clothing. The air itself seemed to have weight, pressing against my skin with invisible hands that left no marks but registered as distinct sensations. Sometimes the pressure was gentle, almost caressing, while other times it felt like being examined by something that understood touch differently than terrestrial creatures. Sleep became elusive during those preparatory days. I would lie awake listening to sounds that had no identifiable source, rhythmic tapping that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, and a low-frequency vibration that I felt more than heard. The vibration traveled through the ground and up into my body, settling in my chest where it resonated with my heartbeat until I couldn't distinguish between the two rhythms. My appetite disappeared gradually, replaced by a sensation of being sustained by something other than food. Water tasted metallic, and solid meals sat in my stomach like foreign objects. Yet I felt energized in a way that didn't correspond to normal patterns of rest and nourishment. My senses became more acute, picking up details in my environment that I'd never noticed before. The texture of air moving across my skin, the subtle variations in background noise, the way shadows fell at angles that defied the position of visible light sources. The first anomaly was so subtle I almost dismissed it as imagination. A scent that didn't belong, drifting through my temporary shelter on air that should have carried only familiar odors. It reminded me of ozone after lightning, mixed with something organic but not quite botanical. The smell would appear without warning and fade just as quickly, leaving me questioning whether it had been real or a trick of memory associating present moments with past experiences. There was also the matter of lost time, though I didn't realize it was missing until much later. I would sit down to read as daylight faded, then suddenly find myself standing by the window with no recollection of having moved. The book would be closed beside the chair, bookmark placed precisely at a page I didn't remember reaching. Outside, the quality of darkness suggested hours had passed, but my internal sense of duration insisted only minutes had elapsed. The nausea began as a faint uneasiness, like the first stirrings of motion sickness. It wasn't connected to anything I'd eaten or any physical activity, but rather seemed to originate from a displacement I couldn't identify. The sensation grew stronger over several days, accompanied by a metallic taste that no amount of water could wash away. Sometimes the nausea would spike suddenly, forcing me to sit down until the world stopped tilting at impossible angles. Looking back to the beginning, I remember how normal everything seemed. I had arrived at the remote site for what was supposed to be a routine period of solitude, a chance to disconnect from the constant noise of modern life. The location was perfect for such purposes, isolated enough to provide genuine quiet, but not so remote as to feel threatening. Rolling hills stretched in all directions, covered with grass that moved in waves when the wind was right. The shelter was basic but comfortable, equipped with everything necessary for a self-sufficient stay. Solar panels provided modest electricity, and a small generator stood ready for emergencies. The silence was profound in a way that city dwellers rarely experience, broken only by the natural sounds of insects and the occasional bird. It was exactly the kind of peace I had been seeking, a return to simpler rhythms and clearer thoughts. I had planned to spend my time reading, writing, and observing the night sky through a small telescope I'd brought along. The area was known for its lack of light pollution, offering views of celestial objects that remained invisible from more populated regions. On that first evening, I set up the telescope and spent hours familiarizing myself with constellations, tracking the movement of planets, and marveling at the density of stars visible in truly dark skies. The weather was perfect, clear and mild, with just enough breeze to keep the air fresh. I fell asleep that first night feeling more relaxed than I had in months, lulled by the gentle sounds of wind moving through grass and the distant call of night birds. Everything was exactly as it should have been, peaceful and restorative, a temporary escape from complexity into simplicity. But even then, in those final moments before everything changed, there was something waiting in the darkness between stars, patient and observant, already aware of my presence in ways I couldn't begin to imagine. Story 3. I sit here now watching that photograph on the mantle, knowing I can never straighten it again. My hands won't obey me anymore. The kitchen clock keeps ticking toward midnight, each sound like a small hammer against my skull. The refrigerator hums its monotonous tune, and I understand now that this is how it ends, not with screaming or running, but with this terrible, peaceful stillness. The wet earth smell drifts through the cracked window, and I breathe it in, tasting metal and something else I can't name. I know what's hidden behind that tilted frame now. I know why I can't look away from it, even though every instinct tells me to close my eyes. The paralysis started in my fingers, I remember that much. I was standing right here in the same spot, staring at that same photograph, when the numbness crept up my arms like cold water rising. I tried to call out, but my voice had already begun to fade. The shadows on the floor seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and I realized they weren't shadows at all. They were moving, breathing, reaching toward me with fingers made of darkness. The lamplight flickered, and in that brief moment of dimness, I saw my reflection in the window glass. My eyes were already changing, pupils dilating until they swallowed the color completely. I watched myself disappear piece by piece, and all I could think was how quiet everything had become. Before the numbness, there was the sound. It came from upstairs, a soft, dragging noise like fabric being pulled across wooden floors. I had been making tea, the kettle just beginning to whistle when I heard it. The sound moved from room to room above me, following a pattern I almost recognized. 3 short drags paused, 3 long ones paused, like a code tapped out in cloth and wood. I turned off the burner and listened, my heart hammering against my ribs. The dragging stopped directly above where I stood, and I could feel weight pressing down through the ceiling, as if something heavy was settling into weight. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my feet, but when I reached the landing, the hallway was empty. Every door stood slightly ajar, revealing slices of darkness beyond. The phone call came while I was still upstairs, searching through rooms that felt wrong, somehow furniture pushed just inches out of place, curtains hanging at odd angles, the air thick with the scent of something sweet and rotting. I rushed downstairs to answer it, my bare feet slapping against the cold wood. The voice on the other end was mine, but older, more tired. It spoke words I don't remember saying, telling me about things that hadn't happened yet, or had they already happened. The conversation lasted hours, though the clock on the wall never moved. When I finally hung up, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely replace the receiver. That's when I noticed the photograph on the mantel had been moved, just slightly, but enough to reveal that corner of whatever was hidden behind it. I had been avoiding the basement for days before that call. Every time I passed the door, I could hear something shifting down there in the darkness. Not footsteps exactly, but a rhythmic movement like breathing made solid, the sound of settling. The lock on the basement door was old and heavy, but I found it hanging open, the key still dangling from the mechanism. I told myself I had forgotten to lock it, but I knew that wasn't true. I never went down there. Not since I found what was waiting at the bottom of those stairs, but standing there in my kitchen, listening to that settling sound, I realized I would have to go back down eventually. Whatever was down there knew I was up here, and it was patient. It could wait. The settling sound started the night I brought the photograph home. I remember hanging it carefully on the mantel, adjusting it until it sat perfectly straight. It was a simple picture, a house that looked almost like mine, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward. But there was something else in the frame, something that didn't belong. A second photograph, smaller, tucked behind the first. I had peeled back the corner to look, and that's when the house began to change around me. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with slow, deliberate rhythm. The floorboards creaked without anyone walking on them, and from somewhere deep below, I heard that first soft thump of something heavy settling into place, followed by the whisper of fabric across wood. I found the photograph in a box I didn't remember owning, sitting on my kitchen table when I came home from work. The box was old, made of dark wood with brass corners that had turned green with age. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, was the frame. The glass was cold, much colder than it should have been, and when I lifted it out, my reflection looked wrong in its surface. Older, more hollow around the eyes. I should have put it back then, should have thrown the whole box away, but I was drawn to the image inside. The house in the photograph called to me, familiar in a way that made my stomach turn. I carried it to the mantel and hung it up, not noticing until much later that there was no return address on the box, no indication of where it had come from or who had left it there. But I'm lying to myself, aren't I? I do remember where the box came from. I remember the moment I first saw it, though my mind keeps trying to skip over that memory like a stone across dark water. It was sitting on the porch when I opened the front door that morning, positioned precisely in the center of the welcome mat. The wood was warm despite the cool air, warm like something alive. When I picked it up, I could feel movement inside, not the photograph, but something else. Something that shifted and settled as I carried it indoors. I set it on the kitchen table and stared at it for a long time before working up the courage to lift the lid. The hinges moved without sound, and the smell that rose from inside was like wet earth after rain, like the scent that even now drifts through my cracked window. The morning I found the box was the morning I woke up in the wrong house. Not wrong, exactly everything was where it should be, every piece of furniture in its proper place. But the angles were different, the shadows fell in new patterns, and when I looked out the windows, the view had changed. The trees were closer, leaning toward the glass as if they wanted to peer inside. The sky held a color I'd never seen before, somewhere between gray and green, like old copper. I walked through each room, touching familiar objects that felt foreign under my fingers. The house remembered me, but I was remembering a different version of myself, one who belonged to a different version of this place. That's when I found the box waiting outside, as if it had been there all along, patient and warm and full of answers I wasn't ready to hear. Story 4. The air felt like it was clinging to my skin, alive with a pulse that matched my own heart but didn't belong to it. A dull hum resonated through the space without source or direction, wrapping around me like an invisible shroud. My fingers brushed against a surface that quivered slightly, as if startled by my touch. There was light, but it flickered like a memory, constantly shifting and never fully illuminating the space around me. My limbs responded sluggishly, as though I moved through water, slow and resisted by the unseen. I sensed things in my periphery, secrets hovering just beyond my gaze. My own reflection never appeared. I was both here and not, suspended between knowing and terror, aware that I was being observed by something just as foreign as the space itself. That's where it always ends, the same sequence playing behind my eyelids whenever I try to sleep. I know it happened to me, but I can't remember when. I can't remember how I got there or how I left. It's like someone took scissors to my memory and cut out everything before and after, leaving only this floating fragment that doesn't connect to anything else in my life. I've been different since then, not in ways other people would notice, but in small, persistent ways that gnaw at me. Food tastes slightly off, like there's a metallic undertone to everything. My shadow seems to lag behind me by just a fraction of a second. Sometimes I catch myself holding my breath without realizing it, as if I'm listening for something that never comes. The worst part is the certainty that something important is missing, not just the memory itself, but something deeper, like a piece of who I am was carefully extracted, leaving behind only the vague impression of its absence. I decided to investigate, not because I expected to find answers, but because the not knowing was becoming unbearable. I started by going through my belongings, looking for anything that might trigger a memory or provide a clue about what happened. That's when I found the recording device. It was tucked behind some books on my shelf, a small digital recorder I didn't remember owning. The battery was nearly dead, but there was one file on it. Just over 11 minutes of audio, recorded in what sounded like my own voice, though I had no memory of making it. I played it back, and my voice emerged from the tiny speaker, distant and strange. I need to document this while I still can. Something's happening to my memory. I can feel it slipping away like water through my fingers. The thing is, I don't think it's natural. Someone or something doesn't want me to remember. There was a pause, filled with a soft static that seemed to breathe. The lights started flickering 3 hours ago, not the normal kind of flickering. They pulse in patterns like they're trying to communicate. And there's this sound underneath everything, this low-frequency hum that makes my teeth ache. My recorded voice became more urgent, more afraid. I can see them now, moving outside the windows, but they're not walking. They're flowing like liquid shadow given form. They know I'm watching. They know I'm recording this, but they're waiting for something. The recording cut to static for several seconds, then resumed with my voice much quieter, almost whispering. The power just went out. Everything's dark except for these moving lights outside. They're getting brighter. I think they're coming inside. Then nothing but static until the file ended. I played it again, trying to recognize any details from the environment, any sounds that might place the recording somewhere specific. But there was nothing familiar about it except my own voice, which sounded like it belonged to a stranger. The recording triggered something, though, not a complete memory, but flashes of sensation, the taste of copper in my mouth, the feeling of cold air moving across my skin in impossible patterns, the sound of my own breathing, amplified and distorted. I remembered standing in darkness, watching points of light move in formation outside a window. They weren't random. They had purpose, intelligence. As I watched them, I felt something shift behind me, a presence that hadn't been there moments before. I turned around in the memory, but there was nothing there. Just empty space that felt somehow occupied, as if something invisible was studying me with the same intensity I'd been watching the lights. The memory fragmented there, dissolving back into the same floating sequence I always remembered. But now there was more context, a sense of before and after, even if I couldn't access those parts directly. I searched my apartment more thoroughly, looking for other evidence. In a drawer I rarely opened, I found a small object I didn't recognize. It was roughly cylindrical, about the size of my thumb, made from some kind of dark metal that felt warm to the touch. When I picked it up, it vibrated slightly, irregularly, like a phone receiving a weak signal. The vibrations weren't random. They came in patterns, clusters of short pulses followed by longer ones. As I held it, the pulses seemed to sync with my heartbeat, or maybe my heartbeat was syncing with them. The distinction became unclear. Holding the object brought another fragment rushing back. I was sitting in a chair that wasn't quite solid, its surface shifting subtly beneath me. My hands were resting on armrests that felt like they were made of the same material as the object I now held. The air smelled of new plastic and cold blood, a combination that should have been nauseating but somehow wasn't. There were voices around me, but not speaking in any language I recognized. The sounds they made were too precise, too mathematical, like equations being spoken aloud. I understood them anyway, though I can't remember what they said. Only that they were discussing me, analyzing me, reaching conclusions about something I couldn't comprehend. One of the voices was closer than the others, speaking directly to me. I tried to respond, but my voice came out wrong, distorted and delayed, as if it was being processed through some kind of filter before reaching my own ears. The memory ended abruptly, leaving me standing in my kitchen, still holding the warm metal object. My reflection in the microwave door looked normal, but when I moved, it seemed to take a fraction of a second longer to follow. I set the object down on the counter and stepped back. It continued to pulse, the vibrations creating tiny ripples in a glass of water nearby. I watched those ripples for a long time, hypnotized by their regularity, until I realized I'd been standing there for over an hour without moving. That's when I started noticing other changes. The sounds in my apartment had shifted. The refrigerator's hum was different, more complex, like multiple frequencies layered on top of each other. When I listened carefully, I could almost hear patterns in it, rhythms that seemed familiar but that I couldn't quite place. My reflection in mirrors had become unreliable. Sometimes it was normal, but other times it showed me from angles that didn't match where I was standing. Once, I saw myself from behind while looking straight into the bathroom mirror, as if the reflection was showing me what someone standing behind me would see. The worst part was the growing certainty that I wasn't alone anymore, not in an obvious way. There were no footsteps, no doors opening, no visible signs of intrusion. But the air in my apartment felt occupied, charged with the presence of something that existed just outside my ability to perceive it directly. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Just the faint impression that something had been there moments before, something that had moved out of sight with impossible speed. I tried to ignore these changes, to convince myself they were psychological side effects of whatever trauma I couldn't remember, but they were becoming more frequent, more pronounced. Then I found the photographs. They were in an envelope tucked inside a book I was certain I'd never read. The photos showed me in places I didn't recognize, doing things I couldn't remember. In one I was standing in what looked like a vast, empty warehouse, but the perspective was wrong. The walls curved in directions that didn't make sense, and the shadows fell at impossible angles. In another photo, I was sitting at a table across from someone whose face was obscured by a blur of motion. My expression in the photo was one of intense concentration, as if I was listening to something important. But there was something else in my eyes, something that looked like fear mixed with fascination. The most disturbing photo showed me lying on what appeared to be an examination table, my eyes open but unfocused. Lights were positioned around the table, casting overlapping shadows that created patterns on my skin. The patterns looked deliberate, purposeful, like some kind of mapping system. I don't remember any of these situations. I don't remember the places, the people, or the circumstances. But looking at the photos triggered the strongest memory fragment yet. I was back in that impossible space from my recurring vision, but now I could see more of it. The walls weren't walls at all, but surfaces that shifted and flowed like liquid mercury. The floor beneath my feet was solid but transparent, revealing layers of machinery or possibly organic structures moving beneath it. The lights that had flickered in my peripheral vision were now clearly visible. They moved with purpose, scanning me, recording me, analyzing every detail of my physical form. I could feel them penetrating my skin, mapping my internal structure, cataloging information I couldn't begin to understand. But I wasn't afraid. That was the most disturbing part of the memory. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt calm, almost euphoric, as if whatever was happening to me was not just acceptable but necessary, even beneficial. The entities conducting the examination were just outside my field of vision, but I could sense their presence. They communicated without words, their thoughts flowing directly into my consciousness. They were explaining something to me, something important about the nature of reality, about the hidden structures underlying everything I thought I knew about existence. I wanted to remember what they told me. I strained against the barriers in my memory, trying to access that knowledge, but it was like trying to hold water in my hands. The harder I grasped for it, the more quickly it slipped away. The memory faded, leaving me standing in my living room with the photographs scattered at my feet. But something had changed. The quality of light in the room was different, more fluid. The shadows moved independently of their sources, shifting and reorganizing themselves into patterns that almost resembled symbols. I picked up the photographs and studied them again. In the last photo, the one showing me on the examination table, I noticed something I'd missed before. In the background, barely visible, was a figure watching the procedure. The figure was human-shaped but wrong somehow, as if it was a rough approximation of human form created by something that had never actually seen a person. As I stared at the figure in the photograph, it seemed to move slightly, turning its head to look directly at me. I blinked and looked again, but now it was facing forward as before. Yet I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still watching me, somehow seeing me through the photograph. I set the pictures aside and tried to think rationally about what was happening to me, but rational thought was becoming difficult. The boundaries between memory and present experience were blurring. Sometimes I wasn't sure if I was remembering something or if it was happening right now. The metal object on my kitchen counter was pulsing more rapidly now, its vibrations creating a low harmonic that seemed to resonate in my bones. When I approached it, the pulsing synchronized with my footsteps, as if it was responding to my proximity. I picked it up again, and immediately another fragment surfaced. I was standing in front of a mirror, but my reflection showed someone else. Not a different person, but a different version of myself. This other me moved independently, performing actions I wasn't taking. It was writing something on a surface I couldn't see, its movements urgent and precise. I tried to read what it was writing, but the letters kept shifting, rearranging themselves into new configurations before I could process them. The other me looked up from its writing and made eye contact with me through the mirror. Its mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. "They're not finished with you yet." The reflection smiled, but it wasn't my smile. It was something else wearing my face, something that found my confusion amusing. I reached out to touch the mirror, and the other me reached out from the other side. Our fingers should have met at the surface of the glass, but instead my hand passed through, touching something cold and wet on the other side. The memory ended with the sensation of being pulled forward through the mirror into a space that existed behind reflections. I opened my eyes and found myself standing in my bathroom, my hand pressed against the mirror above the sink. But the mirror was normal now, showing only my own reflection. A reflection that looked tired and frightened and somehow smaller than I remembered. The investigation was changing me. Each recovered fragment was altering my perception, making me see things that shouldn't be there, remember things that couldn't have happened, but I couldn't stop. The need to understand what had been taken from me was stronger than my fear of what I might discover. I returned to the living room and found that the photographs had rearranged themselves while I was gone. They were now laid out in a specific pattern, forming a sequence that told the story. The story of my abduction, examination, and return. But there was one more photograph now, one I hadn't seen before. This new photo showed me as I was right now, standing in my living room looking down at the photographs. But in the picture there was someone standing behind me, close enough to touch. The figure was clearer than in the other photos, and I could see that it wasn't quite human. Its proportions were wrong, its limbs too long, its face a smooth approximation of human features. I spun around, but my living room was empty. Yet the sense of presence was stronger than ever, so strong I could almost feel breath on the back of my neck. The final memory fragment came without warning, crashing over me like a wave. I was back in the examination room, but this time I could see everything clearly. The entities surrounding me were tall and fluid, their forms shifting between states of matter. They moved like water given consciousness, like thoughts made visible. One of them was speaking directly into my mind, its voice like the sound of wind through empty spaces. It was explaining that they had taken something from me, something important, but it was also giving something back, something I would need for what was coming. "The barrier between your reality and ours is weakening," it said without words. "Soon the distinction will disappear entirely. You have been prepared for this transition. You will serve as a bridge." I tried to ask what it meant, but my thoughts felt sluggish, controlled. The entity continued its explanation, showing me images of a world where the laws of physics had become fluid, where consciousness could reshape matter, where beings like themselves moved freely through spaces that had once been solid. "Your memories of this encounter have been adjusted, not removed," it explained. "They will return when you are ready to fulfill your purpose. Until then, you will experience fragments, glimpses of the truth that awaits." The examination table began to dissolve beneath me, and I felt myself falling through layers of reality, each one slightly different from the last. In some layers, I was still human. In others, I was something else entirely. I landed back in my own body in my own apartment, but everything had changed. The walls were breathing slowly, expanding and contracting like the inside of lungs. The floor rippled beneath my feet like the surface of a pond. The air itself had become visible, flowing in currents that revealed hidden dimensions of space. I looked at my hands and saw that they were translucent, shot through with patterns of light that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I moved, I left trails of luminescence in the air, traces of my passage through space that lingered for several seconds before fading. The metal object in my palm was no longer vibrating. Instead, it had become warm and soft, molding itself to the shape of my grip. As I watched, it began to merge with my skin, becoming part of me, integrating itself into my nervous system. I felt a moment of panic, but it passed quickly, replaced by a sense of completion. This was what had been missing. This was the piece of myself that had been temporarily removed and was now being returned. With the integration complete, I could see the apartment as it really was. The walls were just suggestions, boundaries that could be crossed with the right kind of movement. The furniture existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, solid in some and ethereal in others. And I could see them now, the entities that had been watching me, studying me, preparing me. They filled the spaces between spaces, existing in the gaps where human perception couldn't reach. They had been with me all along, patiently waiting for me to develop the ability to perceive them directly. One of them approached, its form stabilizing into something almost recognizable. It spoke without sound, its meaning appearing directly in my consciousness. The reconstruction is complete. You remember what you need to remember. The transition will begin soon. I wanted to ask when, but I already knew the answer. It wasn't a matter of time, but of readiness, and I was almost ready. The fragments of memory I'd recovered weren't just recollections of past events. They were instructions, preparations for a role I was meant to play in something much larger than myself. The apartment around me continued to shift and flow, reality becoming more fluid with each passing moment. Through the windows, I could see that the outside world was changing too. The buildings across the street flickered between their normal appearance and something else, something that belonged to a different kind of physics entirely. I walked to the window and looked out at a world in transition. Some people on the street below moved normally, unaware of the changes happening around them. Others moved differently, their forms occasionally blurring or becoming transparent, as if they too were beginning to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The sky above was filled with lights that moved in complex patterns, no longer bothering to hide their presence. They were beautiful and terrible, alien yet somehow familiar, like memories of a home I'd never known I'd lost. I pressed my palm against the window, and the glass dissolved at my touch, allowing me to feel the air outside. It carried scents that had no names, sounds that existed below the threshold of normal hearing, textures that could only be perceived through senses I was still developing. The investigation was over, but nothing was resolved. I had recovered the fragments of my memory, understood the nature of my experience, recognized the changes that had been made to me. But understanding hadn't brought closure. Instead, it had revealed that what I'd thought was an ending was actually a beginning. I am no longer entirely human, but I'm not yet something else. I exist in the space between states, serving as a bridge between realities that are slowly merging into one. The entities that examined me are still watching, still waiting, but now I understand that they're not observers. They're architects, and I'm not their subject. I'm their tool. The question that haunts me now isn't what happened to me in that impossible space. The question is what I'm being prepared to do to others, and whether any part of who I used to be will survive the completion of my transformation. But even as I ask this question, I can feel the answer forming in the deepest parts of my consciousness, in places where my original thoughts have been carefully edited and replaced with something else's intentions. Do you remember that feeling of being watched, that sense that something just beyond your perception is studying you with inhuman patience? That's me now. And if you've listened this far, if these words have resonated with something deep in your memory, then perhaps your own reconstruction is about to begin. Story 5. It always clicked over to midnight without fail, the old clock in the hallway with its steady, familiar routine. The soft chime would follow, echoing quietly through the silent rooms, a comforting marker of time's passage. But last Tuesday the chime came twice, a hesitant echo that lingered longer than it should have. At first it seemed a mere quirk, perhaps a trick of my ears or the clock settling into its mechanism. Yet each night since, the clock's voice grows quieter, and now there's a new sound, an indistinct murmur, like an uninvited whisper. Tonight the hands have paused, and midnight feels further away than ever. I'm telling you this because I need you to understand what's still happening to me. Even now, as I speak these words, I can feel the weight of something watching from beyond the edges of what I can see. The clock hasn't chimed properly in weeks. Sometimes it runs backward for hours, the minute hand crawling counterclockwise while that whisper grows stronger, more insistent. My sleep comes in fragments now, if it comes at all. I've learned to recognize the pattern. First, the temperature drops by degrees so subtle you might miss them. Then the humming starts, low and constant, like electricity running through the walls themselves. The sound seems to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a frequency that makes my teeth ache and my vision blur at the edges. The neighbors have stopped returning my calls. I tried to explain about the lights that sweep across my windows in the early morning hours, casting shadows that move independently of any source I can identify. I described how my radio picks up conversations in languages that don't sound quite human, voices that seem to be discussing me in clinical, detached tones. They listened politely at first, but I could see the concern growing in their eyes. Not concern for what I was experiencing, but concern for my mental state. Electronic devices behave strangely around me now. My phone's screen flickers with images I never captured, photographs of places I've never been, showing landscapes that look almost familiar but wrong somehow. The colors are too saturated, the angles of the terrain subtly impossible. My computer turns itself on in the middle of the night, the screen displaying a desktop I don't recognize, filled with files named in symbols that hurt to look at directly. I've started keeping a journal, trying to document these occurrences, but the entries change when I'm not looking. Words I never wrote appear in my handwriting, describing sensations I remember but never recorded. The handwriting is mine, unmistakably, but the thoughts feel foreign, as if someone else is using my hand to communicate things I'm not meant to understand. The feeling of being observed is constant now. It's not the casual awareness of human attention, but something more intense, more analytical, like being studied by an intelligence that sees me as a specimen rather than a person. I catch myself turning to look over my shoulder dozens of times each day, but there's never anyone there, just that sense of presence, patient and unblinking. My reflection has started to bother me, not because it looks different, but because sometimes it moves a fraction of a second before I do, or continues moving after I've stopped. The delay is so brief I almost convince myself I'm imagining it, but it's happening more frequently now. Yesterday I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for 20 minutes trying to catch the discrepancy, but my reflection behaved normally the entire time. It was only when I turned away that I glimpsed, in my peripheral vision, my reflection still standing there, still watching. The dreams are the worst part, though they feel less like dreams and more like memories I'm not supposed to have. I'm always in the same place, standing in an open field under a sky that's the wrong shade of blue. The grass beneath my feet feels real enough, but it doesn't move in the wind, and there are no insects, no birds, no sounds of life at all. In these dreams, I'm waiting for something, though I never know what. I can feel anticipation building in my chest, a mixture of dread and curiosity that makes my heart race even in sleep. Sometimes in these dreams I see others. They stand at the edges of my vision, perfectly still, facing in my direction but too far away for me to make out their features. They never move closer, never speak, but their presence feels significant somehow, like they're there to witness something important. When I try to approach them, they fade away, leaving only empty space and that persistent feeling of being watched. I wake from these dreams with a metallic taste in my mouth and the scent of ozone clinging to my skin. The taste lingers for hours, no matter how much water I drink or how thoroughly I brush my teeth. The smell is harder to describe, like the air after a lightning strike, but sharper, more artificial. It reminds me of something, but I can't quite place the memory. Looking back, I realized the changes started gradually, so subtly that I dismissed them as stress or fatigue. The first sign was probably the way time seemed to slip away from me. I'd sit down to read or work, and suddenly hours had passed without my awareness. Not the normal flow of time when you're absorbed in a task, but complete gaps in my memory, as if someone had simply edited out portions of my day. I began finding myself in different rooms without remembering how I got there. I'd be in the kitchen making coffee, and then I'd come back to awareness standing in the living room, still holding the empty mug with no recollection of the transition. These episodes became more frequent, lasting longer each time. Once I lost nearly an entire afternoon, coming back to myself standing in my backyard, staring up at a clear sky with tears running down my face. The electrical disturbances started around the same time. Light bulbs would flicker when I entered a room, not the random flutter of old wiring, but a deliberate pattern like Morse code. The refrigerator began humming at a different pitch, a tone that seemed to resonate in my bones. My watch stopped working altogether, the digital display showing only symbols that looked vaguely mathematical but followed no logic I could understand. I started noticing the vibrations next. At first, I thought it was construction work somewhere in the neighborhood, a low tremor that made the windows rattle slightly. But the vibrations followed no schedule, occurring at random intervals throughout the day and night. They seemed to come from beneath the ground, as if something massive was moving far below the surface. The sensation was strongest when I was lying in bed, the tremors traveling up through the mattress and into my body, making my pulse synchronize with their rhythm. The humming sound became more noticeable during this period, though I suspect it had been there longer, just below the threshold of conscious awareness. It was most apparent in the quiet moments, a steady drone that seemed to come from the walls themselves. I checked every appliance, every piece of electronic equipment, but I could never locate the source. The sound would stop whenever I actively searched for it, resuming only when I gave up and tried to ignore it. My sense of smell became hypersensitive during this time. I could detect odors that seemed completely out of place, scents that didn't belong in my familiar environment. There was often a sharp, clean smell like bleached metal, or sometimes something organic but unidentifiable like plants that don't exist. These smells would appear suddenly and disappear just as quickly, leaving me wondering if I'd imagined them. The temperature fluctuations were subtle but persistent. I'd feel a sudden chill in a warm room or detect pockets of air that were noticeably warmer or cooler than their surroundings. These variations seemed to move through the house like invisible currents, following patterns I couldn't predict or understand. I checked the heating and cooling systems repeatedly, but everything appeared to be functioning normally. It was during this period that I first noticed the changes in my peripheral vision. Movement that wasn't quite there when I turned to look directly, shadows that seemed to have depth and substance but vanished under direct observation. These glimpses became more frequent, always just outside the range of clear sight, like living things that existed only in the corners of my eyes. The night everything changed completely, I had been experiencing a particularly intense episode of lost time. I remember sitting down after dinner to watch something on television, and the next thing I knew, I was standing outside in my yard, barefoot and disoriented. The grass was wet with dew, suggesting I'd been out there for hours, but I had no memory of going outside or what I might have been doing. Looking up at the sky, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. There was a light perfectly circular and absolutely silent, hovering motionless above the tree line. It wasn't bright enough to illuminate the ground below, but it stood out clearly against the darkness, pulsing with a rhythm that seemed almost organic. The light had a quality I'd never seen before, as if it existed in more dimensions than I could perceive, casting shadows that fell in impossible directions. I stood there watching it for what felt like minutes or maybe hours, time seeming to stretch and compress around me. The light didn't move in any conventional sense, but it seemed to shift somehow, changing position without actually traveling through the space between. One moment it was above the trees to my left, the next it was directly overhead, then off to my right, with no visible transition between positions. As I watched, I became aware of a presence behind me, not human but not entirely alien either. I could feel attention focused on me with an intensity that was almost physical, like standing too close to a source of heat. Every instinct told me to turn around to see what was watching me, but I found myself unable to move. My body simply wouldn't respond to my will, as if I'd become a passenger in my own flesh. The metallic taste in my mouth became overwhelming during this encounter, so strong it made me nauseous. The scent of ozone filled the air around me, mixed with something else, something that reminded me of deep ocean water but with an artificial undertone. My skin began to tingle, not unpleasantly, but with a sensation like mild electrical current running just beneath the surface. Then, without warning, I was back inside my house, sitting in my chair as if nothing had happened. The television was still on, showing the same program I remembered starting to watch, but according to the clock, no time had passed at all. It was as if the entire experience had occurred in the space between 1 second and the next, a pocket of time that existed outside the normal flow of reality. But my feet were still damp with dew, and the taste of metal lingered in my mouth for days afterward. In the weeks leading up to that night, I had begun to notice other subtle anomalies that I now recognize as warnings or preparations. My appetite changed dramatically, with certain foods tasting completely different than I remembered. Familiar flavors became unpalatable, while things I'd never enjoyed suddenly seemed appealing. I found myself craving combinations that should have been disgusting, but somehow satisfied a hunger I couldn't identify. My sleep patterns shifted as well, not just insomnia, but a complete reorganization of my circadian rhythms. I would feel intensely alert during what should have been my most tired hours, and overwhelmingly sleepy when I normally felt most awake. It was as if my internal clock was being gradually adjusted to match some other schedule, some pattern that had nothing to do with the rotation of the Earth. The physical sensations became more pronounced during this preparatory period. I would feel sudden jolts of what seemed like static electricity, but without any apparent source. My hair would stand on end for no reason, and I could sometimes see small sparks jumping between my fingers when I moved my hands. These electrical phenomena seemed to intensify during certain weather conditions, particularly on clear nights when the air was still and dry. I started experiencing episodes of enhanced perception, moments when my senses seemed dramatically amplified. I could hear conversations from impossible distances, see details in darkness that should have been invisible, smell things that were miles away. These episodes were brief but intense, leaving me disoriented and sometimes nauseous when they ended. It was as if someone was periodically adjusting the sensitivity of my nervous system, testing different settings. The earliest sign I can identify, looking back with the clarity that only comes from understanding the complete pattern, was a day that seemed perfectly ordinary at the time. I had been feeling unusually calm and content, enjoying a sense of peace that was rare in my normally anxious life. The weather was mild and pleasant, with a gentle breeze that carried the scent of growing things and distant rain. I spent most of that day outdoors, working in my garden and simply enjoying the sensation of sunlight on my skin. Everything felt harmonious and right, as if I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. There was no urgency, no stress, just a deep sense of satisfaction and belonging that I hadn't experienced in years. But now I understand that this peace was not natural. It was the calm before the storm, the carefully constructed tranquility that preceded everything that was about to change. I was being prepared, made ready for what was coming, my defenses lowered and my resistance diminished. That beautiful, perfect day was the last time I would feel truly human, truly alone in my own mind. Even now, as I finish telling you this, I can feel them out there, patient and watchful, waiting for the next phase to begin. The clock in my hallway has started moving again, but it's running fast now, as if trying to catch up to some schedule I'm not supposed to understand. And in the silence between its ticks, I can hear that whisper growing stronger, more insistent, calling me back to that field under the wrong-colored sky. They're not done with me yet, Story 6. The surface beneath my feet throbbed as if it had a pulse of its own, alien and rhythmic. Surrounding me was a vast expanse of dim, blue luminescence, no distinct source, just a uniform aura that felt both inviting and disorienting. The air was warm, clinging to my skin without the relief of a breeze, and each breath tasted like silence, heavy and unsatisfying. My limbs moved, but it was like swimming through syrup, each motion deliberate yet detached. The sensation of being watched was palpable, though no eyes could be seen, just the unnerving awareness of an unseen presence. I strained to remember how I arrived, but all thought slipped through my grasp, leaving only the unsettling realization that I was not alone in this place. I woke up that first morning feeling oddly refreshed despite the strange dream. The sunlight filtered through my bedroom curtains in familiar patterns, and I could hear the distant hum of traffic outside. It was just stress, I told myself. Work had been overwhelming lately, and my mind was probably processing everything in its own peculiar way. But there was something about that dream that lingered. Not the usual way dreams fade into fragments throughout the day, but something more persistent. The blue light kept flickering at the edges of my vision when I wasn't paying attention. When I closed my eyes to concentrate, I could still feel that pulsing surface beneath my feet. The second time it happened, everything was the same but different. The blue luminescence seemed brighter, more defined. I could make out shapes in the distance now, geometric forms that shifted and rearranged themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. The pulsing beneath my feet had developed a pattern like Morse code, but in a language I didn't recognize. There was a sound this time, a low hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, modulating frequencies that made my teeth ache. When I tried to focus on it, it would shift just beyond my hearing range, leaving only the memory of vibration in my bones. The presence was stronger too, not threatening exactly, but attentive in a way that made my skin crawl. Like being studied under a microscope, every movement catalogued and analyzed. I tried to call out, but my voice made no sound in that space. The air was too thick, too heavy to carry words. I woke up with my heart racing, sheets soaked in sweat, but as the day progressed, I found myself humming. A low, monotonous tune that I didn't recognize. When I caught myself doing it, I'd stop, but within minutes I'd be humming again. The same frequency, the same pattern. It was during lunch that I noticed the first real-world echo. I was sitting in the break room, stirring my coffee, when the fluorescent light above me began to flicker. Not the usual dying bulb flicker, but a rhythmic pulsing. Blue-white, then dim, then blue-white again. The same pattern I'd felt beneath my feet in the dream. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. My coworkers continued their conversations, completely oblivious to the pulsing light that was making my pulse quicken. When I mentioned it to someone, they glanced up briefly and shrugged. "Looks fine to me." That night I found myself reluctant to go to sleep. I stayed up late, scrolling through my phone, watching mindless videos, anything to avoid closing my eyes. But eventually, exhaustion won. The third dream was longer, much longer. I was back in that space, but now I could see more details. The geometric shapes in the distance weren't random at all. They were structures, buildings maybe, though unlike anything I'd ever seen. They curved and folded in ways that hurt to look at directly, as if they existed in more dimensions than my eyes could process. The humming was louder now, and I could distinguish different tones within it. Some high and sharp, others so low I felt them more than heard them. They created harmonies that were almost musical, but wrong somehow. Beautiful and disturbing at the same time. I tried to walk toward the structures, but distance worked differently here. The harder I tried to move forward, the further away everything seemed to become. It was only when I stopped trying, when I let myself drift, that I began to make progress. The presence was no longer just watching. It was communicating, not with words or images, but with sensations. Warmth spreading through my chest when I moved in the right direction, a gentle pressure on my shoulders when I needed to stop. It was guiding me somewhere, and despite every instinct telling me to resist, I found myself following. The blue light began to shift, taking on different hues. Purple at the edges, green in the center, sometimes flashing silver like lightning frozen in time. And through it all, that constant pulsing, that rhythm that was becoming as familiar as my own heartbeat. When I woke up this time, something was different. There was a mark on my arm just above my elbow, a small, circular impression about the size of a quarter. It wasn't painful, but it was definitely there. I couldn't remember bumping into anything, couldn't think of any explanation for it. The mark was perfectly round, with a slight depression in the center. When I touched it, my skin felt different there. Smoother, almost metallic, cold to the touch even though the rest of my body was warm. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I'd slept on something, pressed against the edge of my nightstand or the metal frame of my bed. But deep down I knew that wasn't right. The mark was too precise, too deliberate. Over the next few days, the dreams began to blend into my waking hours. I'd be sitting at my desk, working on a report, when suddenly the computer screen would take on that familiar blue tint. The humming would start low in my ears, and I'd lose track of what I was doing. My coworkers started asking if I was feeling all right. I was losing focus, forgetting conversations, staring off into space for minutes at a time. I'd catch myself humming that strange tune, and when someone asked what song it was, I couldn't explain. The electronic interference got worse. My phone would glitch, displaying symbols instead of text. The radio in my car would pick up strange frequencies, broadcasting that same modulated humming. Even my microwave started acting up, its digital display flickering in that familiar pattern. I began to dread sleep, but I was exhausted all the time. The boundary between dreaming and waking was becoming increasingly blurred. I'd close my eyes for what felt like a moment and find myself back in that blue-lit space, but now it felt more real than my actual bedroom. The fourth dream changed everything. I was there again, but this time I wasn't alone in the same way. The presence had taken shape, though not in any form I could fully comprehend. It was tall and shifting, made of the same blue light that filled the space. When I tried to look directly at it, it would fragment into geometric patterns, but in my peripheral vision, it almost looked familiar. It spoke to me, though not with words. The communication came as pure understanding, concepts flowing directly into my mind. It had been trying to reach me for a long time, it explained. The dreams were just the beginning, a way to establish contact without causing too much disruption. But something had gone wrong. The connection was stronger than expected, and the boundaries were breaking down. What was supposed to remain separate was beginning to merge. I wanted to ask questions to understand what was happening to me, but before I could form the thoughts, the scene began to shift. The blue light intensified, and I felt myself being pulled upward, though there was no sense of movement. The geometric structures grew larger, more complex, until they filled my entire field of vision. The humming reached a crescendo, and suddenly I could understand it. It wasn't just sound, it was language. A complex system of tones and frequencies that carried meaning in ways human speech never could. And in that moment of understanding, I realized I'd been hearing this language my entire life, in the spaces between thoughts, in the silence before sleep. When I woke up, I was standing in my kitchen. The stove was on, a pot of water boiling furiously. I had no memory of getting up, of turning on the burner. The digital clock on the microwave was flashing those strange symbols again, and when I looked closer, I could almost read them. The mark on my arm had changed. It was larger now, and there were others. Small circular impressions running up my forearm in a precise pattern. They didn't hurt, but they were warm to the touch, and when I pressed on them, I could feel a faint vibration beneath my skin. I called in sick to work. I couldn't trust myself to drive, couldn't focus on anything for more than a few minutes at a time. The humming was constant now, a background frequency that never quite went away. Sometimes it would surge, becoming so loud I had to cover my ears, but other times it was barely perceptible, just at the edge of hearing. I started keeping a journal, trying to document what was happening to me, but when I read back over my entries, they didn't make sense. The handwriting was mine, but the words were strange. Technical terms I didn't recognize, descriptions of procedures I'd never heard of, and scattered throughout those same symbols that kept appearing on my electronic devices. The fifth dream wasn't like the others. This time I knew I was dreaming, but I couldn't wake up. The blue space was more vivid than ever, more real than the world I'd left behind. I could feel the texture of the pulsing surface beneath my feet, could taste the metallic air, could smell that sharp, clean scent like ozone after a storm. The presence was waiting for me, and this time when it spoke, I understood every word. Not words exactly, but concepts that formed complete thoughts in my mind. It told me about the connection, about how the barriers between dimensions could sometimes weaken, allowing communication across impossible distances. I had been chosen, it explained, because my mind was already partially open to these frequencies. The dreams weren't random, they were invitations, opportunities to expand my consciousness beyond the limitations of physical reality. But the process was irreversible. Each dream, each moment of contact changed me on a fundamental level. The marks on my skin were just the beginning. Soon, the boundary between my world and theirs would disappear entirely. I tried to resist, tried to pull myself back to waking consciousness, but I was too deep. The blue light was inside me now, flowing through my veins, rewriting my DNA with every pulse. I could feel my thoughts becoming clearer, more complex, as if I was finally using parts of my brain that had been dormant my entire life. When I finally opened my eyes, I was back in my bedroom, but something was fundamentally different. The morning light streaming through my windows had a blue tint that hadn't been there before. The sounds of the outside world seemed muffled, distant, as if I was hearing them through water. I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized myself. My eyes had changed. The irises shot through with flecks of blue that seemed to glow in the dim light. The marks on my arms had spread, creating intricate patterns that spiraled up to my shoulders and across my chest. But the most disturbing change was in my perception. I could see things that weren't there before, geometric patterns overlaying everything, mathematical equations floating in the air, frequencies made visible as ribbons of colored light. The world had become layered, multidimensional, and I was seeing all of it at once. I tried to go about my normal routine, but nothing felt normal anymore. The coffee maker hummed with that familiar frequency. The patterns in my wallpaper shifted and moved when I wasn't looking directly at them. Even my own reflection seemed to flicker, showing glimpses of something else, someone else, superimposed over my familiar features. The phone rang, but when I answered it, there was only that modulated humming on the other end. I hung up, but it rang again immediately. This time, I could almost make out words in the static, instructions in that strange tonal language I was beginning to understand. I stopped answering the phone. I stopped going to work. I unplugged all my electronic devices, but they continued to function anyway, displaying those cryptic symbols, broadcasting frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. The dreams came every night now, but they were no longer dreams. I was fully conscious, fully aware, as I found myself in that blue-lit space. The presence had become more defined, taking on a shape that was almost human but stretched and elongated, as if viewed through a distorting lens. It showed me things, other worlds, other dimensions, other beings like itself who had made contact with minds across the universe. I was part of something vast and complex, a network of consciousness that spanned galaxies. The isolation I'd felt my entire life was just an illusion. I had never been alone. But with understanding came a terrible price. The more I learned, the less I belonged to my original world. My body was changing, adapting to frequencies that human physiology wasn't designed to handle. I could feel my cells restructuring themselves, my nervous system rewiring to accommodate new forms of perception. The marks on my skin had become intricate mandalas of light, pulsing in rhythm with my heartbeat. When I touched them, I could feel the presence responding, acknowledging my transformation. I was becoming something new, something that existed between dimensions. I tried to reach out to others to explain what was happening, but my words came out wrong. The human language felt clumsy and inadequate compared to the pure communication I'd grown accustomed to. When I spoke, people looked at me strangely, as if they couldn't quite understand what I was saying. My reflection in mirrors had become unstable. Sometimes I looked normal, human, familiar, but other times I saw something else entirely tall and shifting, made of blue light and geometric patterns. The presence was no longer separate from me. We were merging, becoming one entity that existed in multiple realities simultaneously. The final dream, if it could still be called a dream, was different from all the others. I found myself back in that first space, with the pulsing surface beneath my feet and the blue luminescence surrounding me. But now I understood what I was seeing. This wasn't an alien world, it was the space between worlds, the dimensional membrane where consciousness could exist without physical form. The presence was there, but it was also me. We had become indistinguishable, two aspects of the same being. It showed me the truth about the dreams, about the connection that had been established. This had all happened before, countless times, with countless minds across the universe. I was just the latest in an infinite chain of consciousness expansion. But something was different this time. As I stood in that familiar blue space, feeling the rhythmic pulse beneath my feet, I noticed something that shouldn't have been there. A small object, metallic and gleaming, lying on the luminescent surface. I bent down to pick it up and my heart stopped. It was my house key, the same key I'd left on my nightstand before going to sleep, but that was impossible. Physical objects couldn't exist in this dimensional space. The presence had explained that to me, had shown me how consciousness could travel while the body remained behind. I held the key in my hand, feeling its weight, its familiar texture. It was real, completely, undeniably real, which meant that either the rules I'd been taught were wrong, or this wasn't a dream at all. It never had been. The blue light around me pulsed once, twice, and then began to fade. But the key remained solid in my palm, warm from my body heat, bearing the scratches and wear marks of years of use. As the luminescence dimmed and the geometric structures dissolved into shadow, I realized with perfect, terrifying clarity that I was no longer dreaming. I had never been dreaming at all. Story 7. The clock ticked twice in a single breath, then hushed, leaving the air taut with expectation. My hand, reaching for the familiar mug, hesitated at its absence, fingers curling around cool, unyielding air. Faint echoes of footsteps lingered behind walls, misaligned with reality, like a memory repeating in the wrong sequence. The floor beneath felt uneven, whispering secrets through each creak as if I stood on shifting ground. And then the tap dripped, but the sink was dry. I've been trying to remember. The doctors say it's normal, that trauma does this thing where it scrambles the filing system in your brain. Everything gets mixed up, shuffled like cards thrown in the air, but I know something's wrong with their explanation. The pieces don't fit the way they should. There's this sound that keeps coming back, a low humming like electricity running through water. It starts behind my left ear and spreads until my whole skull vibrates with it. Sometimes I wake up and my teeth are chattering, not from cold, but from that frequency. The nurses think I'm having seizures, but I know better. I was hearing that sound before whatever happened to me. The light under the door was wrong. That's what I remember most clearly, if you can call any of this clear. Light doesn't bend that way, doesn't pulse with its own heartbeat, but there it was, seeping through the gap like liquid mercury, pooling on the floor in shapes that hurt to look at directly. I tried to touch it once. My finger went numb for 3 days. They found me in the basement, that's what they tell me anyway. Found me curled up behind the furnace, clothes torn, skin cold as winter stone. No memory of how I got there. No memory of what I was running from, but my fingernails were bloody and there were scratches on the walls that matched perfectly. The taste of copper fills my mouth when I think too hard about it. Copper and something else, something organic and wrong. Like meat left too long in the sun, but sweeter. It coats my tongue until I have to spit, but the saliva comes out clear. The taste is only in my memory, they say. Phantom sensations from a damaged brain. I remember standing in a hallway that was too long. The walls stretched away from me in both directions, lined with doors that all looked the same. But they couldn't all be the same, could they? One of them was different. One of them was breathing. I could see it expanding and contracting like a lung, the wood grain rippling with each inhale. When I pressed my ear against it, I heard my own voice whispering from the other side. The man in the corner never moved. He stood there with his back to me, shoulders perfectly still, head tilted at an angle that made my neck ache just looking at it. His clothes were the color of old newspapers, yellowed and brittle looking. I wanted to call out to him, to ask him what he was staring at, but my voice wouldn't work. It was like trying to scream underwater. Sometimes I think I made him up. Sometimes I think he made me up. There was music playing somewhere, but it was all wrong. The melody kept skipping, repeating the same 3 notes over and over until they lost all meaning. It reminded me of a music box I had as a child, the way it would slow down when the spring unwound, each note stretching longer and lower until it became something else entirely. But this music never slowed down. It just kept skipping like a record with a deep scratch. My reflection wasn't my own. I caught glimpses of it in windows, in puddles, in the black screen of the television when it was turned off. But the face looking back had eyes that were too wide, too knowing. It would smile when I frowned, frown when I smiled. Once I saw it move its lips, forming words I couldn't hear. I stopped looking in mirrors after that. The walls were breathing too, not just the door, but all of them. The whole building was alive, inhaling and exhaling in a rhythm that didn't match my heartbeat. The air would get thick and heavy, pressing down on me until I could barely stand, then suddenly thin out until I gasped like a fish on dry land. My lungs burned with each breath, but I couldn't stop breathing. I remember running, my feet slapping against cold concrete, echoing in a space that felt infinite, but I wasn't running toward anything. I was running away from the sound, away from the light, away from the man who never turned around. My legs felt like they were moving through molasses, each step taking forever, going nowhere. The smell of ozone filled the air before it happened. You know that smell, the one that comes before lightning strikes, but there was no storm, no clouds, just that sharp electric scent that made my hair stand on end. And then the humming got louder, so loud I thought my eardrums would burst. I pressed my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound was coming from inside me. They say I was missing for 6 hours. 6 hours that feel like 6 years when I try to remember them. But sometimes in the space between sleeping and waking, I catch glimpses of what happened during those hours. Flashes of impossible geometry, of spaces that folded in on themselves, of doors that opened onto nothing but more doors. The figure in the corner turned around. I don't want to remember this part, but it keeps coming back anyway. When he turned, his face was my face, but older, more tired. His eyes were the color of static, gray and shifting. He opened his mouth to speak, and that's when I started screaming. I'm still screaming, I think. Even now, sitting in this clean white room with its clean white walls, part of me is still back there, still running, still trying to escape from myself. The doctors give me pills that make everything fuzzy around the edges, but they can't touch the core of it. They can't reach the part of me that's still trapped in that breathing hallway. The humming is getting stronger again. I can feel it building behind my eyes, pressing against the inside of my skull like something trying to get out or get in. The light under the door is starting to pulse again. even though there is no door here, just smooth white walls and a window that looks out onto nothing. I think I'm remembering now. I think the pieces are finally falling into place, but I don't want them to. I don't want to know what's waiting for me on the other side of that memory. I don't want to see what the man in the corner was looking at all along. The clock on the wall has stopped ticking. The second hand quivers between two marks, unable to move forward or back. Time itself seems to be holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for me to remember. The taste of copper is back, stronger now, and underneath it, that sweet, organic wrongness that makes my stomach turn. My fingernails are digging into my palms, leaving crescent-shaped marks that sting and bleed, but I can't seem to unclench my fists. Something is coming. I can feel it approaching like a storm front, all pressure and electricity and the promise of violence. The humming in my skull is so loud now that I can barely think, barely breathe. The walls are starting to breathe again, in and out, keeping time with something that isn't my heart. I should stop writing now. I should put down this pen and walk away, pretend that none of this is real, that it's all just trauma and damaged neurons and phantom sensations. But I can't. The memories are too strong, too insistent. They want to be remembered. They want to be real again. The door is opening. There's no door, but it's opening anyway. The light is spilling through, that wrong liquid light that burns without heat. And behind it I can see the hallway stretching away into infinity, lined with doors that breathe and walls that pulse with alien life. The man in the corner is waiting for me. He's always been waiting for me. And now, finally, I think I'm ready to turn around and see what he's been staring at all this time. The humming stops. The sudden silence is deafening, more terrifying than any sound could be. In that silence, I can hear my own voice whispering from behind the breathing door, telling me secrets I don't want to know, truths I'm not ready to face. But ready or not, they're coming back, all of it. Every impossible moment, every twisted detail, every second of those 6 missing hours. The memories are waking up and they're hungry. I can feel them stirring behind my eyes, pressing against the thin membrane that separates past from present, real from unreal. Soon, very soon, they'll break through, and when they do, I'll remember everything. Everything. The pen slips from my fingers. The humming starts again. Story 8. I was seated in the corner, eyes fixed on the picture frame across the room. It had hung straight on the wall as long as I could remember, but now it leaned slightly, as if nudged by a breeze that wasn't there. The room was silent, apart from the soft ticking of the unseen clock, each second stretching longer than the last. Dust motes floated in the beam of light from the window, suspended in the air like the tension that held me captive. A slight shift in the floorboards whispered beneath the stillness, yet no movement followed. I clung to the familiar, watching, waiting, until my eyes returned to the frame. It was no longer askew. It hung perfectly still once more, but the nail, crooked and bare, was missing. That was the moment I knew I had to tell someone. Not because I wanted to, but because the weight of keeping it inside was becoming unbearable. I've been living with this for so long now, carrying it like a stone in my chest. I moved away from that place years ago, put thousands of miles between myself and what happened, but distance doesn't matter when the thing that haunts you lives in your own mind. I've started this confession so many times, written the first few lines, then deleted them. Picked up the phone to call someone, anyone, then hung up before dialing. My voice would catch in my throat, my hands would shake. Even now, speaking into this recording device, I can feel that familiar tightness creeping up my neck, but I have to try. I have to get this out before it consumes what's left of me. It started during what should have been the most ordinary time of my life. I was house sitting for someone, a colleague who'd gone away for several weeks. The house was modest, comfortable, nothing remarkable about it. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a living room with large windows that faced west. The kind of place where you'd expect nothing more exciting than the occasional squirrel on the bird feeder. I remember feeling grateful for the solitude. My own apartment had been under renovation, and the noise had been driving me crazy. This house offered peace, quiet, a chance to catch up on reading and just exist without the constant hammering and drilling. The first few days were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up naturally, make coffee in the unfamiliar kitchen, sit by those west-facing windows and watch the light change throughout the day. The house had its quirks, of course. Old houses always do. The refrigerator hummed a little too loudly. One of the bedroom doors would swing open if you didn't close it firmly. The shower took forever to warm up. These were the kind of minor inconveniences that you adapt to quickly, that become part of the routine. But there was something else, something I noticed on the 3rd or 4th day, though I didn't think much of it at the time. The radio in the kitchen would sometimes tune itself to different stations. I'd leave it on the classical music station while making breakfast, and when I'd come back an hour later it would be playing static, or sometimes a talk show in a language I couldn't identify. I assumed it was just an old radio with loose tuning, the kind of thing that happens when the dial isn't quite stable. That's how it began, you see, with something so mundane, so easily explained away that I barely registered it as unusual. If I'd known then what I know now, I would have packed my bags that very first day the radio changed stations. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, and by the time I understood what was happening, it was already too late. The radio incidents became more frequent. I'd turn it off completely, unplug it even, and still find it playing when I entered the kitchen. Always tuned to that same station with the foreign language, voices speaking in urgent, overlapping whispers that seemed to fade the moment I tried to focus on them. I started leaving the radio unplugged permanently, but that only seemed to make other things in the house more active. The lights began flickering in patterns that didn't seem random. 3 quick flashes, then a pause, then 2 longer ones. It reminded me of Morse code, though I didn't know Morse code well enough to translate it. I checked the electrical panel, looked for loose connections, even called an electrician who found nothing wrong. He tested every outlet, every switch, and everything worked perfectly while he was there. That's when I started keeping a notebook. I told myself I was being scientific about it, documenting the anomalies so I could find a pattern, a logical explanation. But really, I think I was trying to convince myself that writing it down would make it less real, less personal, as if turning my experiences into data points would create some distance between me and whatever was happening. The notebook filled up quickly, radio turning on at exactly the same time each night, lights flickering in the same sequence, but then new things started appearing in my entries. The smell, for instance, a sweet metallic scent that would suddenly fill whatever room I was in, lasting just long enough for me to notice it before disappearing completely. It reminded me of copper pennies mixed with something floral, like roses left too long in water. I started having trouble sleeping, not because of noise or discomfort, but because of a feeling I couldn't shake, the sensation that I wasn't alone in the house. I'd lie in bed, listening to the normal sounds of an old house settling, but underneath those familiar creaks and sighs there was something else, a presence, a weight in the air that seemed to move from room to room. At first I attributed it to anxiety. Being alone in an unfamiliar place, dealing with these minor electrical issues, it made sense that my nerves would be on edge. I tried meditation, warm baths, chamomile tea. Nothing helped. The feeling grew stronger each night until I found myself sleeping with every light in the house turned on. But even with all the lights on, the shadows seemed wrong, too deep in some places, too shallow in others. I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, turn to look, and find nothing there. Except sometimes, just sometimes, I'd notice that a shadow didn't quite match the object casting it. A chair's shadow might be slightly too tall or angled in a direction that didn't align with the light source. The mirrors were the worst part. The house had several of them, old ones with heavy frames that had probably been there for decades. I started avoiding them without really realizing why. When I forced myself to look, my reflection seemed delayed, as if the image took a split second longer to move than it should. And sometimes, in my peripheral vision, I'd see additional movement in the mirror, shapes that shouldn't have been there. I called the homeowner once, trying to ask casual questions about the house's history without sounding crazy. Had they ever noticed anything unusual about the electrical system, any problems with the appliances? They seemed genuinely puzzled by my questions, said they'd never experienced anything like what I was describing. They'd lived there for over a decade, they said, and it had always been a perfectly normal, quiet house. That conversation should have reassured me, but it had the opposite effect. If they'd never experienced these things, what did that mean? Was I losing my mind, or was something specifically targeting me? The turning point came during what I now think of as the night of the white flashes. I was in the living room trying to read when every light bulb in the house suddenly blazed with an intensity that hurt to look at. Not just bright, but white-hot, like staring directly into a camera flash. The brightness lasted only a second, but it left me temporarily blind, seeing purple afterimages dancing across my vision. When my sight cleared, the house was completely dark. Not just the lights I'd had on, but everything. The digital clocks, the small LED indicators on the appliances, even the glow from the street lights outside seemed dimmed. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight and discovered something that made my blood run cold. Every mirror in the house was reflecting light that wasn't there. While everything else remained dark, the mirrors showed bright, normally lit rooms. But the rooms they showed weren't quite right. The furniture was in slightly different positions. The pictures on the walls were different. And in each mirror, standing in the rooms that looked almost like the real rooms but weren't, I could see a figure. The figure looked like me, but wrong. The proportions were off, the movements too fluid, too deliberate. And it was looking back at me with an expression I'd never seen on my own face. Not malevolent exactly, but hungry. As if it was studying me, learning from me, preparing to become me. I dropped the phone, and in the darkness that followed, I heard something I'll never forget. The sound of footsteps moving through the house, but not on the floors. The footsteps were coming from inside the walls, behind the mirrors, in the spaces that shouldn't exist. They moved in perfect synchronization with my own heartbeat, getting faster as my pulse quickened with fear. That's when I ran. I didn't pack, didn't turn off any appliances, didn't lock the door behind me. I just grabbed my car keys and drove until I couldn't drive anymore. I called the homeowner from a hotel 3 states away, made up some excuse about a family emergency, said I had to leave immediately. They were understanding, even concerned about my well-being. I never told them what really happened. But leaving didn't end it. The thing that had been watching me, learning from me, didn't stay behind in that house. It followed me, not physically, but in ways that are harder to explain. I started noticing the same wrongness in mirrors wherever I went. The same delayed reflections, the same sense of being observed by something that wore my face but wasn't me. My sleep never returned to normal. I dream about that house almost every night, but in the dreams I never leave. In the dreams I'm still there, still being watched, still slowly losing pieces of myself to whatever lives behind the mirrors. I wake up exhausted, as if I've been living 2 lives, one in the waking world and one trapped forever in that place. The smell follows me too. That sweet, metallic scent appears at the strangest times. In elevators, in grocery stores, in my own bathroom when I'm brushing my teeth. It's always brief, just long enough to remind me that I'm not free, that whatever connection was formed in that house wasn't severed when I left. I've tried to research what happened to me, but how do you research something that has no name? I've read about hauntings, about psychological breaks, about electromagnetic fields affecting human perception. None of it fits exactly. None of it explains the specific details, the way the experience felt so personal, so targeted. The worst part is the growing certainty that it's not over, that whatever I encountered in that house is still with me, still studying me, still waiting for something. I feel it most strongly when I'm alone, especially in the evening when the light starts to fade. There's a pressure in the air, a weight that settles on my chest like a cat, but cold and patient and utterly foreign. Sometimes I catch myself doing things I don't remember deciding to do. Small things like rearranging objects on my desk or changing the radio station to frequencies that only play static. When I realize what I'm doing, I stop immediately, but the fact that I started at all terrifies me. How much of my behavior is still my own? How much has been influenced by whatever attached itself to me in that house? I moved across the country, changed jobs, even changed my appearance, thinking that distance and reinvention might break whatever hold it has on me. But geography is meaningless when the thing haunting you lives in the space between what you see and what you understand. It's not bound by physical laws or limited by miles traveled. The recording device I'm speaking into right now has been acting strangely since I started this confession. The battery indicator keeps fluctuating, showing full charge one moment and nearly empty the next. The red recording light flickers in that same pattern I remember from the house, 3 quick flashes, then a pause, then 2 longer ones, as if it's trying to communicate or as if something is trying to communicate through it. I know I should stop talking, should delete this recording and try to forget again. But I also know that forgetting is impossible. The thing that followed me from that house lives in my memories now, feeds on my attempts to understand it, grows stronger each time I acknowledge its presence. Even as I speak these words, I can feel it listening, not just to what I'm saying, but to what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. It knows I'm afraid, and that fear nourishes it somehow. But I also sense its satisfaction at finally being acknowledged, at having its existence validated by my confession. I thought that telling someone, even just speaking into a recording device, would provide some relief, but I was wrong. Giving voice to these experiences has made them more real, more present. The air in this room feels thick now, charged with an energy that makes my skin crawl. The shadows in the corners seem deeper than they should be, and I'm afraid to look directly at them. The smell is here now too. That sweet, metallic scent is filling the room, stronger than it's ever been before, and underneath it I detect something new, something that smells like my own fear, my own sweat, but altered somehow, as if it's been filtered through something that isn't quite human. I need to end this recording soon, but I'm afraid of what will happen when I stop talking. As long as I keep speaking, I feel like I have some control, some agency in this situation. But the moment I fall silent, I'll be alone again with whatever has been shadowing me all these years. The truth is, I don't think I ever really left that house. Part of me is still there, will always be there, trapped in those rooms behind the mirrors where everything looks almost normal but isn't. And part of what was in that house came with me, lives in me now, sees through my eyes and speaks through my voice. I can feel it now stronger than ever, pressing against the inside of my skull like a migraine made of whispers. It wants me to stop recording, wants me to put down the device and walk to the nearest mirror. It wants to show me something it's been saving for this moment when my defenses are down and my fear is at its peak. But I won't look, I can't look, because I know that if I see my reflection right now, after speaking all of this aloud, it won't be my reflection looking back. It will be the thing that's been wearing my face, learning my expressions, practicing my mannerisms. And this time, I think it might be ready to make the switch permanent. The recording device is getting hot in my hands now, almost too hot to hold. The red light is flashing faster, more urgently, and behind me I can hear something that sounds like breathing, but too slow, too deep, too deliberate to be human. I want to believe that somewhere, somehow, there's safety from this thing. That if I just keep running, keep moving, keep changing my life, I'll eventually find a place where it can't follow. But deep down, I know the truth. There is no escape from something that lives inside your own mind, that has made itself at home in the spaces between your thoughts. Even now, as I prepare to end this confession, I can feel it smiling with my face. Story 9. It smells of unlit candles, that peculiar waxy aroma, hauntingly sweet yet absent of flame. I stand in the narrow hallway where the wallpaper feels dense with secrets, holding my breath as if that could hold the moment at bay. The scent isn't right for this place, for this moment. It belongs somewhere dim, distant in memory. With each inhale, the air grows heavy, pulling me toward a room left untouched for years, its contents boxed and sealed away. This isn't the first time the smell has crept in, unbidden and persistent. And as it lingers, I know it won't be the last. My fingers trace the wall behind me, feeling for support that isn't there. The wallpaper peels slightly under my touch, curling away like old skin. I understand now what I couldn't before, that some doors once opened change the very air we breathe. The boxes in that room will remain sealed, but their contents have already escaped, seeping through cardboard and time itself. I close my eyes and let the memories flow backward, like water finding its way uphill. The boxes were already stacked when I found myself kneeling beside them, my hands shaking as I pressed the tape down firmly along each seam. The sound it made, that sharp, tearing whisper, seemed too loud in the silence. I had worked methodically, sealing each container as if I were preparing them for a journey to somewhere far away, somewhere they would never return from. The candles lay nested in tissue paper inside the largest box, their surfaces smooth and unmarked. I remember thinking how innocent they looked, how ordinary. My fingertips had brushed against the wax as I arranged them carefully, and even then, even cold and lifeless, they carried that smell. It clung to my skin afterward, no matter how many times I washed my hands. I had counted them as I packed them away, 47 in total. The number felt important somehow, though I couldn't say why. Each one wrapped individually, each one a small secret bundled in white tissue. The room grew dimmer as I worked, shadows stretching longer across the floor, but I didn't turn on the lights. The darkness felt appropriate, necessary even. Before the packing, there was the cleaning. I can still feel the rough texture of the cloth in my hands, still see the way it came away gray with dust and something else, something that left streaks across the surfaces no matter how hard I scrubbed. The cleaning took hours, though time seemed to move strangely in that room, stretching and contracting like something alive. I had started with the windowsill, working my way inward in careful circles. The glass was fogged with condensation that shouldn't have been there, droplets running down in patterns that looked almost deliberate. When I wiped them away, they returned within minutes, as if the room itself was breathing against the glass. The candles were arranged on every surface then, the mantelpiece, the small table by the window, the floor itself in neat rows. They had been beautiful in their uniformity, like soldiers standing at attention. But they were cold, every one of them cold, and had been for some time. The wicks were black and curled, as if they had burned recently, but I knew they hadn't. I would have remembered lighting them. Wouldn't I? The room felt different when I first entered it that final time, before the cleaning and packing began. The air was thick, almost syrupy, and seemed to resist movement. Each step forward required effort, as if I were walking through water. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but the sound was muffled, distant, like hearing voices through a heavy door. I had stood in the doorway for a long time before crossing the threshold. Something about the space felt wrong, changed, though everything appeared exactly as it should be. The furniture was in its proper place, the curtains hung as they always had, but the room felt larger somehow, as if the walls had moved outward while no one was watching. The smell was stronger then, concentrated and cloying. It filled my lungs with each breath, coating my throat with its sweetness. I found myself breathing through my mouth, but even then I could taste it on my tongue, waxy and floral and somehow old, like flowers pressed between the pages of a forgotten book. Before that room, before the candles and the cleaning and the careful packing away, there was the discovery. I remember the moment clearly now, though at the time it seemed insignificant. I had been searching for something else entirely, a book perhaps, or a photograph, when my fingers found the small wooden box pushed far back on the highest shelf. It was unremarkable, the kind of container that might hold jewelry or important papers. The wood was dark with age, smooth from handling, and it fit perfectly in my palm. There was no lock, no visible way to open it, but when I turned it over, the bottom panel slid away with surprising ease. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a single candle, smaller than the others, no longer than my thumb, but perfectly formed. Its surface was carved with tiny symbols that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The wick was pristine, untouched by flame, but as I lifted the candle from its resting place, the smell bloomed around me like something alive. I should have put it back then. I should have slid the panel closed and returned the box to its hiding place on the shelf. Instead, I carried it with me, feeling its weight in my pocket as I moved through the house, feeling its presence like a small, warm heart beating against my leg. But even before the box, before the discovery that changed everything, there was the beginning. The real beginning, so simple and innocent that I almost missed its significance entirely. I was dusting the shelves in the library, running my cloth along the spines of books that hadn't been touched in years, when I noticed the gap. It was small, barely wide enough for a paperback novel, but it stood out among the tightly packed volumes like a missing tooth. I ran my finger along the empty space, feeling the dust that had accumulated there, thicker than it should have been if a book had been removed recently. The gap felt deliberate, purposeful, as if something had been waiting there for a very long time. Above the gap on the shelf just out of easy reach, I could see the corner of something wooden. It had been pushed back far enough to be nearly invisible, hidden behind the larger books that flanked it on either side. I had to stretch to reach it, my fingertips barely able to grasp its edge, and when I finally pulled it free, dust rained down like tiny gray snow. The wooden box sat in my palm, warm despite the coolness of the room, and I knew without understanding how that it belonged in that gap below. It had been waiting there, patient and still, for someone to find it, for me to find it. As I held it, I could smell something faint but distinct rising from its surface, something sweet and waxy, and utterly wrong for a library filled with old books and leather bindings. The smell that would soon fill the room upstairs, that would cling to my clothes and skin, that would follow me down the hallway and into the present moment where I now stand, breathing it in with each reluctant breath. The box felt heavier than it should have, as if it contained something more substantial than a single small candle, as if it contained the weight of all the moments that would follow, the discovery, the room filled with 47 cold candles, the cleaning and packing and sealing away. All of it was there in that first moment, compressed into the smooth wood beneath my fingers. I should have known then what I was beginning. I should have felt the change in the air, the way the light seemed to dim and shift around me. But I was thinking only of the mystery, of the secret that had been hidden away for so long. I was thinking of answers, not of the questions that would multiply and spread like shadows in an empty room. The gap on the shelf seemed to watch me as I turned the box over in my hands, as I discovered the sliding panel and the treasure hidden within. And when I finally slipped that first candle into my pocket and walked away, leaving the empty box behind, the gap remained, waiting, as if it knew I would return, as if it knew that some discoveries can never be undone. Now, standing in this hallway with the smell of unlit candles filling my lungs, I understand what I began that afternoon among the dusty books. I understand why the room upstairs had to be sealed, why some doors should never be opened, why some gaps are meant to remain empty. But understanding comes too late, as it always does. The candle is still in my pocket, warm against my leg, and the smell grows stronger with each passing moment. Soon I know I will have to return to that room. I will have to break the seals I so carefully applied, unpack the boxes I filled with shaking hands, and face what I tried so desperately to contain. The wallpaper behind me continues to peel, curling away in long strips that fall to the floor like shed skin. And in the growing spaces between the paper and the wall, I can see something moving in the darkness, something small and flickering, like the flame of a candle that burns without heat, without light, without ever being lit at all. Story 10. It began with the unmistakable creak of hinges, a sound that shouldn't have existed in a room without doors. Standing by the window, I felt the air tighten around me, as if waiting for something to emerge. The noise persisted, a faint echo slipping between my thoughts, leading them to places they shouldn't go. In the silence that followed, a flash of recognition surfaced, pulling at the edges of memory, a small, worn trapdoor, sealed long ago. My fingers gripped the window frame, grounding me against the rising tide of déjà vu. The room felt smaller somehow, constricting with a familiarity I couldn't shake. I turned, expecting to find myself alone, but the quiet creak continued, and I couldn't remember why it mattered so much that it didn't stop. The smell hits me first in these fragments, sharp, like copper pennies left in rain, mixed with something electric. Ozone, maybe, the kind of scent that makes your teeth ache and your sinuses burn. I remember pressing my face against something cold, metal perhaps, breathing it in until my lungs felt heavy. There was a hum underneath it all, so low I felt it in my bones before I heard it. A mechanical pulse that seemed to sync with my heartbeat, then gradually pull it off rhythm. My skin prickled with static charge, every hair standing on end. The sound built and faded like breathing, but not human breathing, something larger, more deliberate. I can still taste that metallic air when I wake up some mornings, coating the back of my throat like a warning. I wasn't alone. The certainty sits in my chest like a stone, heavy and undeniable. But I can't place the when or where, only the feeling of being observed from angles that shouldn't exist. Eyes in peripheral vision that vanished when I turned. The weight of attention pressing against my back, my shoulders, the top of my head. I remember freezing mid-step, every instinct screaming that movement would give me away. Give what away? To whom? The air felt thick, expectant. Like standing in a theater moments before the curtain rises, except I was both audience and performer, watched and watching. My breathing became conscious, deliberate. Each exhale felt too loud, each inhale insufficient. The presence didn't move, didn't speak, didn't reveal itself. It simply was, and I knew with terrible clarity that acknowledging it would change everything. My thoughts scattered like startled birds. One moment I was reaching for a memory, the next it dissolved, replaced by something foreign. Concepts that didn't belong to me crowded my consciousness. Words and languages I didn't recognize echoed in my head, their meaning somehow clear despite their strangeness. I found myself knowing things I'd never learned: the precise temperature of air 3 feet above my head, the electromagnetic frequency of the lights overhead, the exact number of dust particles suspended in the shaft of sunlight across the room. Information flooded in without invitation, overwhelming my ability to process. I pressed my palms against my temples, trying to contain thoughts that felt too large for my skull. The world tilted, familiar objects becoming alien. My own hands looked strange, the pattern of lines across my palms suddenly foreign territory. I couldn't trust my own mind anymore. Light exploded behind my eyes in jagged bursts, not the gentle illumination of lamps or sunlight, but something harsh and clinical that cut through darkness like surgical blades. I remember the sensation of falling upward, my stomach lurching as gravity seemed to reverse. Surfaces that should have been solid rippled like water under my touch. The air itself became visible, shimmering with patterns that hurt to follow. Sounds layered over each other: the creak of hinges, that low mechanical hum, and something new. A whisper that might have been wind through leaves, or voices speaking in frequencies just beyond my hearing. My body felt disconnected, movements delayed as if signals were traveling through thick syrup to reach my limbs. Time stretched and compressed. Seconds felt like hours, hours collapsed into heartbeats. And through it all, that persistent creaking, keeping time with something I couldn't name. The headache started after, not pain exactly, but pressure. Like someone had installed a radio antenna in my skull and forgotten to tune it properly. Static filled the spaces between thoughts, making concentration feel like swimming upstream. I'd catch myself staring at walls, searching for patterns that weren't there. My reflection in mirrors seemed delayed, movements lagging just slightly behind intention. Food tasted different colors, appeared more vivid in my peripheral vision, but washed out when I looked directly. Sleep brought no relief, only dreams of that mechanical humming and the sensation of being watched. I began avoiding reflective surfaces, uncomfortable with the stranger looking back. My shadow fell at wrong angles, or maybe I was seeing angles that weren't meant to be seen. The world felt tilted 1 degree off its axis, everything familiar made subtly wrong. But wait, the memory shifts, details rearranging themselves like puzzle pieces, finding new configurations. The light wasn't harsh at all, it was soft, warm, almost welcoming. I remember reaching toward it, fingers stretching into that golden glow. The falling sensation becomes floating, weightless, and peaceful. The whispers resolve into something like music, harmonies that made my chest vibrate with resonance. Instead of fear, I felt curiosity. Wonder even. My body moved with fluid grace, each gesture perfectly synchronized with that underlying rhythm. The air didn't shimmer with alien patterns, but with beauty too complex for normal perception. I wanted to stay in that space, to let myself dissolve into those frequencies. The creaking sound became a lullaby, comforting and familiar. Which version is true? Both feel equally real, equally false. Memory is a liar, but it's the only witness I have. I don't try to understand anymore. Understanding requires logic, causation, linear progression from before to after. What I carry now exists outside those frameworks. Some mornings I wake with the taste of ozone in my mouth and the echo of hinges creaking in empty rooms. I've learned not to turn when I feel those invisible eyes, not to question thoughts that arrive fully formed from nowhere. The trapdoor in my memory remains sealed, but I know it's there, waiting. The mechanical hum has become the soundtrack to my daily life, so constant I only notice it when it stops. And sometimes in the space between sleep and waking, I remember wanting to go back, to step through whatever opened when that impossible sound first reached my ears. But memory is merciful in its confusion. The details blur, the edges soften, the truth becomes negotiable. I am no longer the same person who stood by that window, gripping the frame against recognition. That person wanted answers. I've learned to live with questions that have no names.